stage number 2, when we come over here, and for those of you who take Microsoft courses, you may have noticed that this is not covered within the courses. Remember, different instructors customize depending upon their needs. I customize as an instructor extensively, normally, if I have the time, that is. Not very unusual at all, because typically my philosophy is to add best practices into courses. For those of you who haven't taken Microsoft or haven't taken a bunch of tool-based types classes or how-to, this wouldn't the issue wouldn't apply at all. Now for stage 2, though, let's come over here. For stage 2, once we actually come over here now, our second part that we have to think about is we have to think about what's called the management system right over here. How are we going to store that data? See, there's just one little issue over here. This is where we store all the data, or at least store where to go get it, or at least store its location so we can find it. Oh, that's big. That's big. That's really, really big. Because now what we've got over here is we've got this second part coming over here. Now, for the management system, you have to understand that typically the most classical way that you're going to actually store that information or store the majority of information is in what's called a database. So typically, you're going to store the information. The first place where you store information is in a database or a series of databases known as a repository. So the first place where you store information is in a database or databases known as a repository. Think about it for a second. Take SharePoint, for example. Microsoft's version is, of course, of a CMS system. In SharePoint, what you end up doing is you end up taking data. Right? And whenever you create new data inside of SharePoint, what's going to end up happening then is over here is that by creating new data now, you're going to turn around now and be able to access that data. But wait, you got to store it somewhere. So what SharePoint does is SharePoint uses Microsoft's SQL Server to be able to store all of that information. That's what it does. And that's a database. WordPress uses MySQL to be able to store all of that information that's being created, right? In the collection process, you just defined how you were going to get information. You might get information through forms or whatever else. In the management process now, you're all about how am I going to store that information and whatever else. And then not only that, not only is this going to be how am I going to store information, right? But something else that you start to think about also after you start thinking about how am I going to store all the information is you start thinking to yourself, how am I going to also access all the information? For example, if you need to access an Oracle database, then you have to think about Oracle connections. You need to access a Microsoft SQL Server database, SQL Server connections, MySQL database, MySQL connections. You need to think about things like that inside of Advanced. So as you begin to go through typically on best practices, you start doing things like defining what are known as connections, which essentially tell you connections, which are essentially the way that you can access information. Like usernames, passwords. You need to think about other things too, like how big is this going to become? Yep, because let me tell you, CMS systems or content management systems can get real big real fast, and when they do, crash, you name it, complete crash. I mean, they can crash a company and cause a company to turn around and have to buy big time, and I mean big time equipment. But you also get another issue too. The other issue is you get repeated data, bad data, things like that that start to come in that really begin to do things to the company like waste money, waste space, and lead to inaccurate figures, which can be dangerous, very dangerous. Okay, the next thing you need to do over there is once you finish actually storing the data, right? Sometimes you don't actually store the data in a form that can be consumed. For example, I'll give you a classic case, XML data typically that comes in that may be stored as XML documents. Typically, people don't consume XML documents directly. Developers do, but not business users who are using it to make decisions. You need to figure out a series of steps, essentially, okay? A series of steps where you essentially take that information, all right, and you actually turn around and you actually get it ready for consumption, so to speak. Consumption. So that's another big thing you have to think about, is you have to start thinking about workflows. In other words, how am I going to make the data ready to consume in an automated process? As you guys can guess, again, this is a huge subset, huge area, so to speak, with many consultants coming in. At the very beginning, this almost seems intuitive. The tools will do it by themselves. It's later on where best practices and making sure that someone followed the correct practices begin to matter on something like this, and that's no matter where you go. Finally, guys, finally. So you got your data inside your management system. You've used collection first to be able to say, this is how we're going to get data, and this is where we're going to get it from. Then you use the management system to say, this is how we're going to store data, and this is what kind of form it's going to be stored in. And if we need to make it available, these are the automated workflows, automated processes, or automated process type of methodology that we're going to implement to be able to make this data ready for consumption. But you see, there's still just one more step over here, okay? And just one more step right over there. How do you decide when to pull data out of the repository? See, that becomes really big too. For example, do you just want anybody being able to access confidential information like company strategic reports and things like that? Probably not. Probably not. In fact, I've never seen anywhere that actually did. That could be real dangerous. Corporate spies do that kind of thing. That's a no-no. So what you really need is you need some sort of system that's going to allow you to be able to define exactly how that information goes to the public, which information is available to whom, and which information is available to be used for what. That's what you're looking for. That's known as publishing. So in stage number 3, this is known as publishing. And as you guys can guess, once again, the methodologies are well known. So in stage 3, publishing. How can we make data how do we make data out of the repository available? And for who do we make it available to? And for who do we make the data available? That's what we want to know. Boom. That's it. Right there. Those 3 things are your fundamentals. Publishing, management, whatever else. Publishing, we'll typically see things like approvers. And we'll see things like publication services like RMS and whatever else, and you name it. Ways that we can, RSS. Ways that we can publish content available for multiple different people. And we'll see branding websites and and all these templates, you name it. For it's known as publishing sites, which you typically see in almost every CMS system, by the way. We'll have templates available that actually help us. In the management layer, we're looking at how to manage data very specifically inside the repository. We're looking at key ways that we can actually store it, make it more efficient. Do things like not wreck our actual CMS system. And then finally, or first, it was collection. How do we actually get that data? And we begin to define core processes. I don't care if the process is someone taking a piece of paper out, writing something in a pencil, and then scanning it. That's still a process for how we were putting information in there. We need to define that. So when you've got all 3 of these defined, now you've got a CMS system. Now, the reason why I mention this before we end this particular one is because, guys, you have to think about this now, and you have to think about these concerns. Many shops will implement a CMS system without knowing any of this. And as you can guess, their projects oftentimes fail with them running through multitudes of consulting firms, spending bunches of money, and failing again and again and again because they did not do these steps right. I'm going to tell you right now, it is so much easier to do these in the beginning. What's a lot harder is to implement them later on after people get into bad habits, unfortunately, and that happens a lot. But they can still be implemented, even partially implemented appropriately. When someone's aware of these sorts of stages, you're going to typically see big gains for a company. So that covers our fundamentals for CMS systems. On the next stage in the next lecture, I'm going to begin to teach you Microsoft's system, and we're going to begin to implement many of these principles. Look forward to it, and thank you very much.